The HOA's fake officers slammed me against the hood of my truck, steel cuffs biting into my wrists like they were arresting some clueless cattle rancher who didn't know his rights. I didn't resist. I stayed calm. Leaned toward their leader close enough he could smell the coffee still on my breath and whispered 5 words that drained the color from his face. "You just kidnapped the state attorney." His hands went slack on my shoulder. Behind him, the other 2 fake cops froze mid-reach for their radios. I leaned closer, voice quiet, deadly. "Pray the sheriff gets here before I start filing charges." That was the moment everything shifted. Not because they believed me, men like that never believe anything until a badge forces it into their skulls, but because for the first time since they'd stormed onto my land, they hesitated. Just half a second, just enough for the truth to start sinking its claws in. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to how this whole mess began. My name is Daniel Cross, 53 years old. I own 40 acres of cedar, dust, sunburned fences, and a sky so big it'll swallow a man whole if he looks at it too long. People always ask me why I still live out here. Why a man with my credentials, University of Texas Law, 26 years as a prosecutor, state attorney for the criminal division would choose dirt roads over downtown Austin. Truth is, I never saw it as choosing one over the other. I saw it as staying home. I was born on this dirt. My father was born on it. My grandfather carved this place out of raw land with nothing but calloused hands, a stubborn streak, and enough faith to carry a family through 3 generations. This soil remembers us. It remembers my granddad's boots when he walked the fence line every morning before the sun came up. It remembers my dad's hands, thick with work, tightening the same bolts I still tighten today. It remembers me as a boy running barefoot through the hay fields, thinking the whole world smelled like diesel and fresh-cut cedar. Folks today think land is just acreage and market value. But out here, land is a ledger of every man who ever bled for it. And mine's full. I never needed much. Just a porch that faces the sunset. A barn with a crooked roof my father never got around to fixing, and a fence line that marks where my responsibility begins and ends. See, that's the thing about fences. People think fences keep others out. But out here, fences remind you what's yours to take care of. It's not about separation, it's about duty. My days were simple before all this started. I'd wake before dawn, brew coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, and listen to the cattle complain about breakfast being 5 minutes late. I'd walk the same trails I'd walked since I was big enough to fit in my daddy's shadow. Some mornings I'd just stand there, hands on my hips, letting the quiet settle into my bones. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And for most of my life, nobody questioned that. Nobody crossed the fence line without knocking first. Nobody looked at my land like it was a blank canvas for their development dreams. Nobody waved a clipboard at me like it could change the shape of what 3 generations built with sweat instead of signatures. But that was before Pinewood Ridge Estates showed up, before the Texas modern houses with perfect driveways and imported mailboxes. Before the city folks started paying extra for country charm and complaining the moment they realized country charm includes cows, dust, and honest work. Before people started looking at my place like an inconvenience to their property values. Funny thing is, I didn't mind having neighbors. I didn't mind new homes or new families. What I minded was the attitude. The idea that I should change because they arrived. The idea that their rules were supposed to apply to the dirt under my boots. The idea that a homeowners association 20 feet past my southern fence thought they had the right to harmonize the environment. They didn't see the history. They saw a messy barn. They didn't see the stories. They saw non-compliant structures. They didn't see a legacy. They saw an eyesore impacting visual cohesion. Visual cohesion. I'll admit, I laughed the first time I heard that one. But the laughing stopped when they sent people to suggest improvements. Stopped when drones buzzed over my cattle like mechanical hornets. Stopped when strangers walked up with polished boots and that look in their eyes, the one that says, "We've already decided what's best for you." No, the laughing stopped long before the night they slapped cuffs on me. And, if you want the honest truth, It wasn't the cuffs that bothered me. It wasn't the fake officers or the threats or even the insult of being dragged off my own land. What bothered me was this. For the first time in my life, someone looked at my home and saw a prize instead of a legacy. And folks like that, they never stop at the fence line. Not until you make them. It was a Sunday morning when I met Victoria Hayes for the very first time. The kind of morning that should have stayed peaceful. Sun climbing slow over the ridge, cattle pushing against the fence for fresh hay, cicadas humming like they'd already given up on the day's heat. I'd just finished tightening a sagging wire by the south pasture when I heard voices at the gate. Not friendly voices, voices with intention. I wiped the sweat off my neck and looked up. Two figures stood by my fence. One man, one woman. Dressed like they'd walked straight out of a real estate brochure, clean boots, clothes too crisp to trust, not a speck of dust between them despite the wind kicking up grit like it was getting paid for it. The woman smiled first, a big polished smile with all the warmth of a porch light left on by accident. "Mr. Cross?" she called out, lifting a clipboard like it was some sort of badge. "We're with the Pinewood Ridge Estates Welcome Committee. Welcome Committee, standing on my land without being invited." I walked toward the gate slow, boots crunching gravel, letting the silence between us stretch long enough to see who would flinch first. Neither did. City folks rarely understand silence the way country folks do. To them, it's awkward. To us, it's information. When I reached the fence, I leaned on the post, folded my arms, and waited. The woman cleared her throat, nervous, but determined. We just wanted to stop by and introduce ourselves. We're beginning a new initiative to maintain aesthetic cohesion and ensure property value stability across the community. The man beside her nodded like he was paid per nod. I raised an eyebrow. Community? Which community would that be? Pinewood Ridge Estates, she said brightly. Our development runs adjacent to your property. Adjacent, I repeated, isn't the same as included. Her smile twitched. Just a hair, but enough to tell me she wasn't used to being corrected. Well, she said, a lot of our residents have expressed concerns about the visual contrast along the shared boundary. Visual contrast, I said. You mean my barn and fencing? She nodded quickly. And livestock visibility. Some felt the cattle were quite close to their yards. I stared at her. She looked back, clipboard held like a shield. You know, I said slowly, the cows were here before your mailboxes were. The man interrupted, trying his polite tone. We think a few modifications could make things more harmonious. That word again. Harmonious. Always used by people who have never hammered a fence post in their life. I stepped closer, resting both hands on the top rail. Ma'am, I said, I'm not under your HOA. My land isn't part of any covenant, community rulebook, or whatever glossy packet you hand out with your welcome baskets. Her smile got tighter, like she'd rehearsed being pleasant, but never rehearsed what to do when pleasant didn't work. Well, she said, glancing at her clipboard, technically, the county maps show your property within our visual improvement zone, so we'd appreciate your cooperation. And then she made the mistake that lit the fuse. She looked at my boots covered in dust from the south pasture, at my shirt sweat-stained from fixing fence line, at my hands rough from a lifetime of real work, and she said, in that soft, condescending tone only HOA presidents and irritated librarians seem to master. People like you don't always understand zoning law, Mr. Cross, but we do. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't give her the satisfaction of visible anger. I just smiled, small, slow, dangerous. Is that so? Her confidence flickered. I'm sure once you look over our guidelines, you'll see we're simply trying to create order. I nodded once. You know what's funny, ma'am? She tilted her head, just enough to show annoyance. You walked onto my land to tell me about order. The man tugged her elbow, whispering something about other houses to visit. She gave me one last strained smile, then turned on those spotless heels and walked back toward their SUV, parked half on the county road, half on my gravel, like they couldn't decide who really owned what. As they drove away, dust curling behind their bumper, I felt something shift deep in my chest. A warning, a certainty, a promise. That woman wasn't here to welcome me. She was here to test the fence line. And people like her, they never stop at the first post. I wish I could tell you that first visit was the end of it. That Victoria walked away, realized she'd barked up the wrong tree, and left my land and my life alone. But folks like Victoria don't work that way. They don't back up. They don't slow down. And they sure don't take no for an answer. 3 days after our little fence line chat, the first drone showed up. It came in low over the cedar grove, whirring, dipping, swinging its little camera eye like a buzzard looking for fresh roadkill. My cattle didn't care, but I did. I watched it skim over the barn roof, stutter a moment as the wind caught it, then hover directly above the feed pen like it had every right to be there. I didn't wave, I didn't shout, I just tilted my hat back and stared at it. It zipped away. The second drone arrived the next morning. Smoother, quieter, upgraded even. Whoever was flying these things had money to burn and nerve to spare. Later that same day, I noticed a pair of HOA folks walking the easement along the county road. Not on my land, but close enough to breathe the dust off it. They weren't sightseeing. They weren't admiring the view. They had clipboards. Always the clipboards. One held a digital camera and snapped a dozen photos of my fence, my barn, my tool shed things no HOA rulebook had any jurisdiction over. The other carried a measuring wheel, dragged it along the fence line, shaking his head now and then like he'd found evidence of a crime scene. They didn't wave, didn't greet me, didn't even pretend courtesy, just worked. Work that wasn't theirs to do. The following week, the letters started. At first, they were polite emails from the HOA office requesting updates to my non-standard fencing materials. Then came warnings about livestock odor conditions and visual disharmony affecting neighborhood value perception. Visual disharmony. That's when I knew Victoria had written these herself. Nobody else strings nonsense that pretty. I ignored them. But ignoring a mosquito doesn't stop it from biting. And refusing to swat a wasp only encourages it to bring friends. 2 weeks later, I stepped out onto the porch and saw 2 HOA volunteers standing 20 feet from my barn pretending to assess boundary improvements. One had on a Pinewood Ridge polo shirt tucked so tight into his pants you'd think he was smuggling a rulebook under his ribs. The other wore sunglasses too fancy for Texas dust and acted like the sun owed him a refund. I walked toward them slowly, each step grinding gravel beneath my boots. "Morning," I said, keeping it even. They flinched just a little, but the man with the sunglasses recovered quick. "We're conducting an initial visual survey," he explained. "Residents have expressed concern about the state of structures adjoining the shared community perimeter." I eyed the barn behind me. "Shared perimeter? That barn's older than your subdivision." He didn't laugh. Most people don't when they come uninvited. They backed off soon enough, though. People who abuse authority wilt fast when you stand tall and don't blink. But their retreat didn't bring peace. Every sunrise I'd find something new. Fresh tire marks near the southern gate, footprints where nobody should have been walking, camera flashes from the road after dark. HOA newsletters slipped into my mailbox, each one filled with more concerns, not questions, concerns, like they were diagnosing a problem, and I was the patient. One afternoon, while I was sharpening the brush cutter behind the barn, I caught another drone hovering so low it rattled the tin roofing. I grabbed a handful of gravel, tossed it skyward, and nailed the drone's underside. It wobbled like it'd been slapped, then shot off so fast I could almost hear the operator panicking. That night, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the window. The fields were dark, wind brushing the grass in slow waves. Peaceful, but thinner now. Like someone had scraped away the top layer of calm. I'd lived on this land my whole life. I knew the sound of coyotes, the rustle of deer, the whisper of the wind in the fence wire. But I'd never heard strangers talk about reclaiming aesthetics, never seen folks treat a barn like an eyesore, never had neighbors 500 feet away act like they owned 60 years of family sweat. Something was building. A pressure. A push. And the thing about pressure is this: sooner or later, it makes someone crack. The HOA's whole strategy counted on that. Me snapping first. But I wasn't the one about to break. No, they were. It was a Wednesday. One of those dry Texas mornings where the sun rises mean and stays that way. I'd been repairing a loose hinge on the north gate when a white pickup rolled into view, county logo on the door, clipboards on the dash. Two men in orange vests. At first glance, they looked official. But I've lived long enough to know that looking official and being official aren't the same thing. The taller one stepped out, chewing gum like he was trying to kill it. "You the property owner?" he asked. "Last I checked," I said. "We're here on behalf of the County Structure and Safety Division. Got a report about an unsafe barn and potential livestock exposure violations." Livestock exposure, another phrase cooked up in an HOA meeting room. I took a slow step toward the truck, letting my eyes wander over the decals. The county seal was wrong. Too bright. Too stretched. Like someone printed it off a website that didn't care much about legal consequences. "You got paperwork?" I asked. He slapped a packet into my hand. Thin paper. No watermark. No signature. The form number didn't match the county's formatting. And the signature box? Blank. I flipped to the first page. "Y'all, sure this is a county document?" The gum chewer didn't blink. "Of course it is." His partner nodded too fast. Panic wrapped in confidence as camouflage. They started walking toward my barn, snapping photos, muttering about structural incongruence. I followed them slowly, letting them dig their hole deeper. The taller one pulled on the barn door like he owned it. "How old is this structure?" he asked. "Old enough to outlast both of us," I said. He didn't like that answer. People pretending to be in charge rarely do. Inside, the barn smelled of hay, leather, and a little dust. Same as it had for 50 years. But they didn't see that. What they saw was ammunition. "This roof isn't compliant with," he started. "With what?" I cut in. "County code? Or your HOA's wish list?" He froze. For half a second. Half a second too long. I'd seen enough. "You boys from the county?" I said quietly. "Or from Pinewood Ridge?" Their eyes flicked at each other. Dead giveaway. Real county inspectors don't flinch. They don't sweat. They don't improvise. The taller guy stiffened. "We're contracted through the HOA to assist with—" "There it is," I said. The truth took longer than I expected. I lifted the packet again and let the paper crinkle between my fingers. The tall one suddenly reached for it. "Can I have that back?" I folded the document neatly and slid it into my back pocket. "No," I said calmly. "This is addressed to my property. It stays with the property." He looked like he wanted to argue, but fighting a man on his own land over a fake document wasn't in his pay grade. They went back to snapping photos, pretending they hadn't already exposed themselves. But I didn't kick them off the property. Not yet. I needed something more valuable than pride. I needed proof. And in Texas, impersonating a public servant is a third-degree felony. Penal Code Section 37.11, 2 to 10 years in prison. And by admitting they were contracted while wearing county colors, they just handed me conspiracy charges too. I didn't interrupt them. Never interrupt an enemy when he's busy incriminating himself. When they finally left dust rising behind their truck like smoke from a dying fire, I walked straight into the house, sat at the kitchen table, took out a notebook, and wrote down everything. Time of arrival, names, fake as they were, license plate, document inconsistencies, recorded phrases, behavior, direction of travel, every detail. Because I knew right then that this wasn't just nosiness or HOA overreach. This was strategy. A long, slow squeeze, meant to push me into a corner. A trap designed by people who thought intimidation beats preparation, but intimidation doesn't work on men who've spent their lives in courtrooms. That night, after supper, I drove into town and bought 4 trail cameras, 2 audio recorders, and enough batteries to survive a blackout. mounted the cameras in cedar posts, under the barn eaves, in the branches of the live oak, and one disguised inside an old birdhouse. By the time the moon rose, my ranch had eyes, better ones than the HOA would ever expect. The next time they trespassed, I wouldn't just see them, I'd catch them. And I'd make sure the law saw them too, because if Pinewood Ridge wanted a war of paperwork, pressure, and fake uniforms, they'd just declared it on the wrong man. A week passed. The drones came less openly, but more often. The HOA inspectors stopped knocking and switched to circling. Cars driving slow, phones raised, pretending to record sunsets while aiming at my barn. I kept watching, kept logging, kept collecting every breadcrumb they dropped. And then, suddenly, the whole picture snapped into focus. I was picking up feed in town when Earl, the county clerk who'd been guarding public records since the Ford administration, waved me over with a stack of papers under his arm. "Daniel, you're going to want to see this." He didn't use that tone lightly. He set a map in front of me. Not a county survey, not a zoning update. This was a development blueprint. Fresh print, bright ink, too clean to be official, too bold to be accidental. And highlighted in neon yellow was my land. Acreage lines redrawn without my consent. Fence lines erased. My well marked as a future shared utility. My jaw tightened. What exactly am I looking at? Earl slid a second document forward. An annexation proposal, complete with the Pinewood Ridge HOA seal. The ink was still glossy. A smear of blue on the corner like someone had slammed the stamp down too fast. "That seal's new," Earl muttered. "Way too new." Then he handed me the third page, a plat map, except my southern boundary was 30 yards north of reality. My barn was absent, my pond labeled as Phase 4 water feature. I didn't speak, didn't curse, didn't even breathe for a beat. Because forged maps aren't just lies. Forged maps are weapons. "This didn't come from our office," Earl said, voice low. "Someone created this offsite and filed it as a preliminary inquiry, hoping nobody would check it." "Who submitted it?" I asked. He hesitated, then exhaled. "Victoria Hayes, HOA president." And suddenly everything, the drones, the fake inspectors, the harassing letters clicked into place like the last tumblers in a safe. This wasn't compliance. This wasn't neighborhood drama. This was a land grab, a coordinated one. With the developer's name stamped on the bottom, Lone Star Horizon Development Group. I studied the forged plat in my hands. Lines clean, geometry perfect, crime disguised as architecture. Inside my head, something old and sharp switched on. The prosecutor's lens. Forgery. Fraud. Conspiracy. Those were bad enough on their own. But tied to a corporate entity, like a developer, that's when the temperature changes. "Interesting," I murmured under my breath. "In Texas, when someone forges land documents for financial gain, you stop looking at petty crime. And when they do it with a cooperating organization, an HOA tied to a developer, you stop looking at local charges altogether." I folded the map slowly, deliberately. "You start looking at RICO," I said quietly. Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. A land scam across entities. Victoria wasn't running a homeowners association anymore. She was running a criminal enterprise. Earl raised an eyebrow. "You think it's that big?" "I don't think," I replied. "I recognize the pattern. Organized pressure, manufactured violations, fake inspectors, forged boundaries, a developer waiting in the wings." This was extortion wrapped in landscaping guidelines. I walked outside, the sun hot on my face, let the dry Texas wind cool the anger rising in my chest. Because I had enough experience to know something important. Criminal enterprises don't crumble from outside pressure. They crack from inside leaks. "I've got the what," I murmured, tapping the forged map. "I've got the how, the signatures, the filings, the fake stamps." I looked toward the highway, dust drifting across the horizon. But to nail them to the wall, I need the why. I needed the money trail. The kickbacks, the emails, The proof of what Victoria was getting in return for selling out her own community. Because no HOA president redraws a man's land for free, not even the arrogant ones. Especially not the arrogant ones. As I drove home, my mind wasn't on the fence lines or the cattle or the sunset over the pasture. It was on Victoria Hayes, and on the one missing piece I needed before this became a federal case. I pulled into my driveway, dust curling under the tires, and thought, someone inside that HOA knows the truth. Someone scared, someone tired, someone ready to talk. I didn't know his name yet, but he was out there. And when he finally broke, this whole criminal empire disguised as an HOA was going to come crashing down, brick by forged brick. Dusk has a way of quieting the world, slowing things down so a man can hear trouble long before he sees it. That evening, the trouble didn't come loud, didn't come in a truck or on boots, or through a broken gate. It came in the shape of a thin man standing stiff beside my mailbox. He looked like a scarecrow someone had forgotten to anchor to the ground. Nervous, windblown, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. His HOA polo shirt hung off him like a uniform he'd never earned. His khaki pants were wrinkled at the knee from pacing. When he finally noticed me walking toward him, he straightened up as if preparing for judgment. "You lost?" I asked gently. He shook his head too quickly. No, sir. I'm looking for Daniel Cross. I wiped my hands on my jeans. You found him." He swallowed, then forced out the words, "My name is Nathan Porter. I'm on the Pinewood Ridge HOA board." If he expected me to react, he didn't know me. I just leaned on the fence, studying him. Unlike Victoria's clipboard soldiers and those fake inspectors she'd sent, Nathan wasn't puffed up with borrowed authority. He looked more like a man who'd just sprinted away from something burning. "What brings a board member this far out?" I asked. "Another lecture about fence aesthetics?" He winced, like the joke hit too close to home. "No, nothing like that. I shouldn't even be here. If Victoria finds out." He froze, eyes darting down the road. This wasn't arrogance. This was fear. "Relax," I said quietly. "You're on my land. Nobody here bites." He nodded shakily, then reached into his jacket pocket, slow, cautious, like he expected I might mistake him for a threat. But what he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a USB drive. Black, unmarked. Scratched along the edge as if it had been hidden inside drawers, sock boxes, glove compartments. He held it out with trembling hands. "I brought you something." I didn't take it. "Not yet." "Tell me what it is," his voice cracked. "It's everything." I stayed silent. He kept talking, because he needed to. Emails, meeting notes, financial transfers, Victoria's annexation documents, developer agreements, and a memo she wrote about you. My jaw tightened, but my face stayed neutral. "What kind of memo?" His eyes dropped to the ground. She labeled you as a non-compliant obstruction." He swallowed. "She told the board last week that you had to be neutralized before the development deal closed." I let that sink in. Neutralized. A word criminals use when they don't expect the law to be watching. "How long has all this been going on?" I asked. Nathan rubbed the back of his neck, guilt etched in every line of his face. "I joined the board 6 months ago. I thought it was community work, silly things, lawns and paint colors. But then the documents started appearing. Maps that didn't match county records. Blank forms Victoria made us sign. And the developer, well, say it," I said. "They wired money to the HOA discretionary fund, large amounts, with notes like strategic partnership reimbursement, kickbacks, a tale as old as greed." A gust of wind moved past us, carrying cedar dust and the scent of dusk. "And now you're here," I said. "Why risk your neck for me?" His chest tightened. "Because here came the truth. Because yesterday Victoria held a closed meeting with the enforcement committee. I didn't interrupt." He licked his lips, eyes wide with remembered fear. "When they came out, they weren't talking about citations or fines." He clutched his hands together. One of them, Todd asked her, "Are you sure we should go that far?" And she said, "He swallowed." She said, "He won't comply. So we'll handle him. Handle. Neutralize. Same vocabulary, same intent. Nathan took a step closer. I didn't understand what she meant until I heard her say the enforcement team would be visiting your property soon. She sounded thrilled about it. He looked up at me. That's when I knew something very wrong was about to happen to you. His timeline was perfect. He didn't know about any arrest. He only knew about the plan. I finally took the USB from his hand. It felt heavy, like a trigger or a verdict. You know what happens when you give me this? I asked softly. He nodded. Whistleblower protections. That's right, the moment I plug this in, you stop being part of the problem and start being part of the evidence. His shoulders slumped with exhausted relief. I want out. I want this to stop. Victoria's lost control. She thinks the developer will protect her. She thinks the HOA will cover her tracks. He looked up at me. She thinks she's untouchable. I tucked the USB into my pocket. Well, I said, she's about to learn what happens when someone mistakes a prosecutor for a pushover. Nathan let out a long, shaking breath. I've done my part. Please, make this end. It will, I said. For her. He walked away without another word. Small, hunched, swallowed by the fading light. Not a villain, not a hero. Just a man who couldn't carry Victoria's sins anymore. When I reached the porch, the USB knocked lightly against my hip. Inside it, I now had forged maps, annexation plans, kickbacks, internal memos, illegal coordination, meeting recordings, the skeleton of a criminal enterprise masquerading as an HOA. And tomorrow I'd pry the whole rotten thing open, because Pinewood Ridge wanted a war, and now I had the ammunition. The night came in thick and heavy. One of those moonless Texas nights where even the coyotes stay quiet, the kind of night criminals prefer, and cowards too. I'd been sitting on my porch since before sundown. Boots up, revolver holstered but close. Not because I planned to use it, but because sometimes having a weapon nearby reminds you that you don't need to. The USB sat open on my laptop inside. Emails, kickbacks, internal meeting notes. Victoria's annexation scheme. Financial transfers from the developer that were so sloppy, they might as well have been written in crayon. Every line strengthened the case. Every detail tightened the noose. But Victoria wasn't thinking about court anymore. She was thinking about revenge. Around midnight, the dogs lifted their heads, ears pricked, bodies stiff. A low growl rolled out of Duke's throat like thunder warming up. Easy, boy, I whispered, because I'd been waiting for this. The gravel road at the end of my drive crackled under tires. Slow, deliberate, not the speed of a visitor. The speed of hunters. 3 figures emerged, shadows in tactical gear, wearing black vests stenciled with the ridiculous title HOA Community Enforcement. Their silhouettes were big, armored, heavy-looking in the dark, but the gait, the movements. I'd seen tougher men sorting mail. The lead guy tapped something on his radio, then motioned the other 2 to circle wide. A tactical approach, amateurish, but rehearsed. They weren't here to talk, not tonight. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and said quietly, "There it is." The moment Victoria finally crossed the line, she couldn't step back over. The leader stopped 20 feet from my porch. "Daniel Cross," he barked, voice cracking like he was trying too hard. "Step forward. You are under community arrest for hostile interference with HOA operations." Community arrest. Still hilarious. I didn't move, didn't stand, didn't blink, just stared at him like he'd interrupted my coffee. "You got a warrant?" I asked calmly. "We don't need one," he snapped. "We have authority under the Pinewood Ridge Charter." "The Charter?" I echoed. "Is that what you're calling toilet paper these days?" He didn't appreciate that. One of the others stepped forward. "Hand on a baton. This is your last warning." "No," I said. "It's yours." They exchanged confused looks. Fake cops always expect fear. They never expect composure, especially not from a man who spent 26 years putting real criminals behind real bars. The leader stiffened. "Take him. The two flanked me fast, stomping up the porch steps. The boards creaked under their gear. They grabbed my arms, yanked me up, slammed me against the siding so hard dust fell from the roof. My shoulder throbbed. The dogs barked wildly behind me, but I didn't resist, not an inch. Resistance turns into assault. Compliance turns into kidnapping. And tonight, I needed them to cross that line cleanly. They forced my hands behind my back. Cold steel cuffs snapped shut. Real cuffs, not zip ties. Exactly what I needed. Face forward, the leader ordered. I tilted my head slightly, enough to speak, but not enough to look threatening. You boys know this is a felony, right? I whispered. Shut up, he snapped. You sure? I said. No second thoughts? He shoved me toward my truck. Move. I let them, one step at a time, slow, deliberate, because every second of this assault was building my case for tomorrow. They pinned me over the hood, searching me like I was carrying the secrets of Fort Knox. Their breath smelled like cheap coffee and cheaper authority, and then I stopped breathing for half a second, because I knew this was the moment, the pivot, the turn, the hinge between their arrogance and their downfall. I leaned toward the leader, voice low, controlled, ice cold. You didn't just cuff a rancher. I felt him pause. You just kidnapped the state attorney. His entire body went rigid. The hand gripping my shoulder loosened. One of the fake officers inhaled sharply. What? What? The leader stammered. I turned my head just enough for him to see my eyes. You heard me. He stepped back like he'd been shot. You're lying, Victoria said. Victoria, I said, is about to need a lawyer more than I do. Silence. Wind. Dogs barking in the distance. I leaned in one last time. Just enough for my breath to hit the space between us. Pray the sheriff gets here before I start correcting your mistakes. His face went dead white. He opened his mouth to speak, but that's when the headlights cut through the darkness. A second vehicle. This one fast, controlled, purposeful. Red and blue strobes burst across the tree line. The leader spun toward the light. No! No! Turn off the lights! He barked at no one. Pure panic in his voice, but the lights kept coming. A sheriff's cruiser slid to a stop in a spray of gravel. The door flew open, and out stepped Sheriff Tom Alvarez, a man built like a boulder and twice as patient. He took one look at me cuffed, bruised, then at the pretend police. His jaw clenched. What in God's name do you boys think you're doing? The fake leader stuttered. Sheriff, we were performing a community arrest. A what? Alvarez barked. It's authorized under the HOA. Authorized by hell, Alvarez snapped. Put your weapons on the ground, now. The night froze, because suddenly, Victoria's soldiers understood the one truth they'd never learned in their HOA meetings. Real law beats fake law. Every single time. Sheriff Alvarez didn't walk toward us. He marched. Heavy boots crushing gravel. Shoulders squared the way men look when they've already decided someone's going to jail tonight. The fake officers froze, caught between fear and denial. Two ingredients that never mix well. Step away from him, Alvarez barked. The leader raised his hands halfway, unsure whether to argue or surrender. Sheriff, this is a lawful community enforcement action. Under Alvarez stopped so close, their vests brushed. You finish that sentence, he growled, and I'll add stupidity to the list of charges. Silence swallowed the night. Duke, my dog, growled low beside the porch like he wanted to punctuate the moment. Alvarez turned to me. You all right, Daniel? Been better, I said calmly. He nodded. We'll fix that real quick. Then he snapped back toward the fake officers with the kind of authority you can't fake. Can't buy, can't print on a vest. Hands off him. Now, they obeyed instantly. Because even the dumbest criminals can spot a man who knows the law and isn't afraid to use it. The cuffs clattered to the dirt as one of them fumbled nervously with the key. I rolled my wrists, the skin raw but unbroken. Alvarez watched, jaw tight, Then he spoke the words that flipped the night upside down. Gentlemen, you are under investigation for kidnapping, armed wrongful confinement, and impersonating a public servant. 3 felony charges, 3 life-changing mistakes. The leader stammered. Impersonation? We never said we were police. Alvarez stepped forward until their badges nearly touched. You're wearing tactical gear with enforcement patches. You used handcuffs. You conducted a forced detainment. And you claimed legal authority you do not have. He jammed a finger at the patches reading HOA Community Enforcement. You think slapping the letters HOA in front of enforcement makes it legal? No one answered. He leaned even closer, voice dropping into something cold enough to freeze bone. And you're not officers, not deputized, not licensed, not qualified. He straightened, eyes narrowing into a warning carved out of steel. You do not have qualified immunity, not a shred of it. One of the fake officers sucked in a sharp breath. That line hit them harder than any punch could. Because without qualified immunity, every action they took tonight, every bruise, every shove, every second of those cuffs was personal liability. They could lose their savings, their homes, their freedom. Panic rippled through them like electricity. We were just following Victoria's orders, the smaller one blurted. Alvarez turned slowly. Oh, that's adorable. You're trying the Nuremberg defense. Blank stares. He sighed. Doesn't work. Not tonight. Not ever. He motioned to the radio mic on his shoulder. Dispatch, send 2 units to my location. We've got 3 in custody. Charges pending. The leader snapped. We're not criminals. Victoria told us this was legal. I finally stepped forward, brushing dust off my sleeves. You boys ever wonder why Victoria never puts anything in writing? Why she never signs her own directives? Why everything she tells you comes through whispers and backdoor meetings? They stared. Because she knows it's illegal, I said. She knows the moment this goes to court, she can throw you under the bus and say she never authorized anything. The smallest officer's face crumbled first. She said we'd be protected. Protected by who? I asked. An HOA president facing fraud charges? A developer about to be indicted on racketeering? Alvarez tilted his head. Oh, and how do you know about that, Daniel? I smirked. Let's just say I've been busy. Before Alvarez could respond, a phone rang. Not mine, not the sheriff's, the leader's. He hesitated, then answered with a trembling hand. Hello? Even from 10 feet away, I heard her. Victoria, her voice sharp, frantic, high-pitched, bled through the speaker. Why aren't you done yet? Why hasn't he been brought in? Do you have any idea what this delay is costing? Alvarez ripped the phone out of the man's hand so fast the officer yelped. The sheriff held the phone up calmly. Mrs. Hayes, he said with a politeness so fake it glittered. This is Sheriff Alvarez. Dead silence on the line. Then, Sheriff, I was under the impression... No, he said. No impressions, no excuses. No lies. He stepped away from the fake officers, pacing slowly, letting each word hit her like a hammer. You ordered unlicensed private security to detain a man. You provided them false legal authority. You instructed them to use restraints. And you misrepresented this as a lawful action. Victoria's voice trembled. I never said. You said enough. Alvarez cut in. Consider this a courtesy call. You can either come down to the station voluntarily tomorrow morning, he paused, or I can send a unit to bring you in. Victoria's breath hitched. Bring me in for what? For starters, Alvarez said, impersonation, conspiracy, evidence, tampering, and attempted kidnapping. The dogs barked. Wind rustled the trees. And somewhere on the other end of the phone, Victoria's entire world cracked. Sheriff, please. Click. He hung up. The leader stared at me like I'd summoned the devil himself. You? He pointed weakly. You tricked us. I shook my head slowly. No, I just didn't stop you from committing the crimes you chose to commit. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Nothing came out. A cruiser pulled in behind Alvarez. Then another. Red and blue lights splashed across the pasture like fireworks. The sheriff turned to me. "You pressing charges?" I didn't hesitate. "Every single one available under Texas law," he nodded. "That's what I figured." As the fake officers were cuffed, ironically, with the same model cuffs they'd used on me, I stepped back toward my porch. My wrist still hurt. My shoulder still throbbed. But justice? Justice felt real close. And Victoria? Victoria had no idea that this was only the beginning. The courthouse smelled like old paper and polished oak. The scent of justice, if you ask older lawyers. I'd walked through those doors hundreds of times, but never as the victim. Never as the man whose wrists were bruised by criminals pretending to uphold community harmony. The courtroom was packed. Media, neighbors, curious onlookers. And there, at the defense table, sat Victoria Hayes, stiff-backed, wrapped in armor she'd chosen carefully. A crimson-red blazer so perfectly tailored it looked like it was holding her together by force alone. The color aggressive, bold, rude, the kind of red that demands attention and refuses apology. Underneath, a black silk blouse with a deep V-neck, professional, calculated, just provocative enough to distract, to suggest confidence, control, power. A crimson pencil skirt matched the blazer perfectly, same shade, fitted, a subtle slit at the knee suggesting movement, flexibility, readiness. Glossy red heels clicked against the courtroom floor like countdown timers, matching the blazer, matching her lips, coordinated down to the smallest detail. Her auburn hair fell in perfect waves to her shoulders, styled, professional, not a strand out of place. Glossy red lips curved into that porcelain smile. Same shade as the heels, as the blazer, as the crimson veneer of authority she'd wrapped herself in. She looked like power, like certainty, like a woman who'd spent years learning how to wear control like a second skin. Her lawyer, a thin man with a suit loud enough to be illegal in some counties, kept whispering frantically to her. Judge Rollins entered, robes flowing, eyes sharp. Court is now in session. This is the matter of State of Texas v. Victoria Hayes. Preliminary hearing. Victoria stood, forcing a smile. "Your Honor, I believe this is all a misunderstanding." Rollins cut her off with a raised palm. "Mrs. Hayes, sit." Victoria sat fast. The courtroom doors opened behind me. Even before I stepped in, Victoria's breath hitched. She remembered me in work boots, dust-covered shirt, hands rough from ranch work. She wasn't prepared to see me like this. Tailored charcoal suit, polished shoes, state attorney badge on my belt, posture steady, controlled, surgical. I didn't glare at her, didn't acknowledge her. I simply walked with the calm confidence of a man who has both the evidence and the law. Victoria whispered to her lawyer, panic seeping through her voice. He looks different," her lawyer swallowed. "That is the state attorney." Victoria shook her head violently. "He can't be. He's a rancher." I paused just long enough to glance her way. "No, Victoria, I'm a rancher because I like peace. I let that hang. I'm a prosecutor because I'm very good at ending wars." She dropped her gaze, cheeks flushing red. Judge Rollins turned toward me. "Mr. Cross, please present your statement." I stepped forward. "Your Honor, I'd like to offer Exhibits A through G." I laid them out methodically. Forged annexation maps, falsified HOA filings, financial transfers from Lone Star Horizon Development Group, internal emails provided by whistleblower Nathan Porter, audio recordings of coercion. The altered video attempted to be used as evidence in this very courtroom, and county documentation proving Mrs. Hayes submitted fraudulent boundary claims. Victoria's lawyer shot up. "Objection. This evidence was obtained legally. I finished. And more importantly, it's hers." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Proceed, Mr. Cross." I nodded toward the monitor. "Let's begin with the fake video Mrs. Hayes submitted last week." I brought up the clip again, the same one she'd sworn was real. Then I opened the metadata. The judge's lips tightened. "Mrs. Hayes," she said slowly, "do you deny altering this video?" Victoria stood, hands shaking. "Your Honor, I didn't alter anything. Someone else. Someone must have tampered." Rollins's voice cracked like a whip. "Spare me. You submitted it. You signed the affidavit. You represented its authenticity," her lawyer whispered. "Victoria, please sit down." But Victoria was unraveling. This is all blown out of proportion. He wasn't supposed to resist. He was supposed to follow community orders. Rollins slammed her gavel. "He is a private citizen, not your subordinate." The courtroom went silent. I pulled out the USB Nathan gave me. "Your Honor, this drive contains the complete internal communication trail of the Pinewood Ridge HOA." Rollins nodded. "Admit it." I opened a folder titled Committee Notes. Victoria's lawyer squinted. "What are those?" "Minutes," I said. "Your client never expected to see daylight." I clicked the file. A recording played. Victoria's voice, sharp, cold. "If Cross won't agree to annexation voluntarily, we'll create pressure points until he folds. Forced citations, inspections, enforcement team if necessary." The judge's eyes widened. Another clip. "Once his land is declared non-compliant, Lone Star Horizons will buy it at reduced value. And we get our kickback." Victoria's face drained of color. Gasps filled the courtroom. Even her own lawyer closed his eyes in resignation. I closed the files gently, calm, deadly. "Your Honor," I said softly, "in the state of Texas, this is organized coercion. It is fraud, extortion, forgery, evidence tampering, and kidnapping." I paused. "And when a criminal enterprise involves a corporate partner such as Lone Star Horizon Development Group, it qualifies under the RICO Act." Victoria snapped. "RICO? You can't charge an HOA with RICO." I turned to her, finally giving her my full attention. "Victoria, organized crime isn't defined by who you think you are. It's defined by what you did." She stumbled backward into her chair. "You're twisting things," Victoria whispered. "You're manipulating this." I stepped closer. "No, Victoria. I'm just applying the law you said I didn't understand." Her eyes widened with recognition. Because weeks ago, she'd stood in front of me with perfectly clean shoes and said, "People like you don't understand the law. We have rules here." Now I leaned in. Voice low enough, the courtroom held its breath. "I don't just understand the law, Victoria." I straightened, letting the weight of the moment hang. "I write the indictments." The room erupted. Even Judge Rollins paused, just long enough to let the power of the sentence land. Then she said, "Bailiff, take Mrs. Hayes into custody pending full trial. Charges to include fraud, conspiracy, evidence tampering, forgery, and attempted unlawful detention. RICO consideration is hereby forwarded to the state's Organized Crime Division." Victoria collapsed into her chair, sobbing. Her lawyer backed away as if she were radioactive, and the judge turned to me. "Mr. Cross, thank you for your service." I bowed my head. "Just doing my job, Your Honor." Even on my days off, Victoria was led out of the courtroom in cuffs, hands trembling. Lipstick smudged. The heels she'd always used to tower over people now clicking like a metronome, counting down the end of her kingdom. That crimson blazer, the armor she'd worn into battle, now hung on her like a defeated flag. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. But every pair of eyes in that room followed her. The board members she'd manipulated. The neighbors she'd intimidated. Even the developer's representative who'd suddenly found something very interesting on the ceiling. Her empire of forms, fines, and forged signatures was gone in a single walk toward the holding cell. Word spread fast. By the time I stepped out onto the courthouse steps, a small crowd had gathered. Homeowners from Pinewood Ridge. Faces conflicted, some embarrassed, some relieved, some carrying the weight of knowing they'd followed Victoria out of fear or convenience. A man in his 70s approached first. I recognized him from a meeting months back, The one who'd stared at his shoes while Victoria lectured me about visual cohesion. Now he removed his hat, holding it to his chest. "Mr. Cross, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. We didn't know what she'd been doing behind closed doors. I met his eyes. There was remorse there. Real, honest remorse. "You know now," I said. "That's what matters." Others followed. A mother who'd once complained about my rural smells. A young couple who'd taken photos of my barn for safety documentation. Even the HOA treasurer who looked like he hadn't slept in a month. Each one said the same thing in different voices. "I'm sorry." And for the first time since this whole thing began, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. Not forgiveness that comes slow, but recognition that not everyone in Pinewood Ridge was rotten, just misled by the wrong queen. Sheriff Alvarez joined me outside, hat tipped low. "Rico Division's already digging," he said. "Lone Star Horizons is lawyering up hard. That's usually a sign they're guilty as sin." I nodded. "They'll fold. Developers always do when the spotlight's pointed straight at the money." Alvarez chuckled. "You sure you don't want to come back to the DA's office full-time? We could use someone who knows how to handle trouble this tidy." I shook my head, looking out toward the highway, the long stretch of road leading back to my ranch. "I like my trouble predictable," I said. "Fence lines and cattle don't usually commit felonies." He laughed at that, clapped my shoulder, and left me to the breeze. Later that afternoon, I drove home. The sun was lowering behind the Cedar Ridge, painting the land in that soft, forgiving gold. Texas keeps just for the end of long battles. My gate repaired now swung open with a gentle groan. Duke ran alongside the truck, tail high. Relieved that things were finally settling back into the rhythm he understood, I walked the fence line slowly. Boots in the dust, hands deep in my pockets. The air smelled cleaner. The wind felt easier. Even the silence sounded different, lighter somehow, like the land had been holding its breath along with me, waiting for the storm to break. When I reached the porch, the phone buzzed. A text from Nathan Porter. "It's over. Thank you." I typed back, "For now." Because people like Victoria aren't rare. They're just loud. And HOAs like hers, they pop up everywhere. Authority gets confused with arrogance. I hung my hat on the same nail my father used, poured myself a coffee even though the day was nearly gone, and stepped outside one last time. The fields were quiet. The wind was soft. The fences stood straight. Peace. Not the kind you pray for, but the kind you earn. And as I watched the sun settle over the land, I defended not with fists, not with guns, but with truth. I said the only thing left to say. I don't just understand the law. I took a sip of coffee. Let the warmth settle. I write the indictments.